Since there are some new faces here, I should tell you a few things about the Foreign Policy Research Institute. For those who are not familiar, it was founded in 1955 on the premise that a nation should think before it acts. It was good advice then. It remains good advice today. Our mission is to bring the insights of scholarship to bear on the foreign policy challenges facing the United States, and our method is to do so through the geopolitical perspective, which is to look at contemporary issues through the lens of history, geography, and culture, or as one of my colleagues likes to say, we study the realities of the mentalities of the localities. We also educate the American public, we train teachers, and we train students through our internship program. And we're very proud of that internship program. Today, for instance, the current coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department, the current strategic advisor to the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and a current member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff are all FPRI interns. So we're very proud of that record. If you are not a member of FPRI, today is a good day to become one. If you already are a member, we urge you to become a higher level member. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jeremy Black. He is a non-resident fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is also a professor of history at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. We like to bring him over from Britain once a year, but actually, being a nonprofit, we like to get others to bring him over from Britain. And as it happens, he's here on the East Coast to address the New York Historical Society this coming Saturday in our joint lecture series with them, and his topic on Saturday is Eisenhower and the Cold War. If he ends up talking about Eisenhower and the American Revolutionary War, I hope you'll forgive him. Jeremy is not just a historian, he is a historic figure in his own right. Because as the author of over 100 books, I think he is probably the most prolific historian to have ever lived. So we have a true figure in our midst. Now, if you were to get to know Jeremy, you would see that he has a very genial personality, very cheerful. And that brings to mind the insight of another one of my colleagues, which is that just because you know history doesn't make you a pessimist. So I'd like to introduce the optimistic historian, Jeremy Black.
Thank you very much, Alan. 40 minutes, is that right? 40 minutes? Yeah, that's right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I'd like to reiterate Alan's comments about the link with the Union League. I've stayed here on a number of occasions when I have spoken. I think both institutions play a tremendous role in Philadelphia's public culture today. And part of living in any society, the same in my country, is the nature of people joining together to take forward both knowledge, sociability, and policy. So, the very fact that you're here today, socializing with each other, keeping two institutions active as opposed to just being buildings of the past. Many congratulations. Geopolitics and the American Revolution. Well, Alan mentioned geopolitics and the Civil War, and in a sense, they are two separate sides of the same coin. Because the key aspect of the geopolitics of the Civil War is that there was no foreign intervention, that the war did not spread to a wider sphere, that the foreign powers that seriously considered entering that war, namely Britain and France, did not do so, because that would have created a much greater struggle, that would have created a struggle with many more imponderables and counterfactuals, and if we get to questions, I'm not sure whether they're allowed in this format, but if we do, I'd happily talk about that. But of course, the situation with the American Revolution was the complete opposite. Part of the problem with thinking about the American Revolution is that one is apt to forget that it was both a civil war and a world war. It became a world war in 1778 when France entered the war against the British. It spread. France had the second biggest empire in the world, the second biggest fleet after the British. It became an even bigger world war in 1779 when the Spaniards came in, world's third largest navy at that time, and then in 1780 the Dutch came in. So this was a struggle which it's all too easy if you're sitting here and, we all create accounts of our own history which focus on ourselves. That's entirely normal. It's necessary if you live in a community to do that. But it's helpful to understand and appreciate that for Americans in the 1770s, considering how best to make their revolution succeed, part of the issue was how was it going to focus in the wider world. Now, let me just try and probe that slightly further. The usual way in which the revolution is presented in the United States, funnily enough, doesn't give the Americans much credit for winning, because the usual way it's presented is that, in a sense, the British were anachronistic figures bound to lose in their silly uniforms, deploying in a foolish fashion, standing against the will of the people, and often led by a sort of redundant monarchy. And obviously the British were going to lose, and the Americans would get a bit cold at Valley Forge, but otherwise, looking valiant, they would be bound to prevail. And you all know the pictures. You all know the pictures. You've seen them in films. You've seen them in American textbooks of about a generation or two ago. On one side of a field, you have sort of lines of redcoats slowly moving forward, the sun glinting on their bayonets. And on the other side of the field, behind trees and stone walls, sort of crouching down slightly, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to kneel, but are brave patriots clad in green and brown and about to blast these idiots to pieces. So in other words, the war is clear, the war was bound to be won by the Americans, and therefore, in a sense, what happened on a global level was completely inconsequential. Well, if it had been that easy, and that was in a sense what people signed up for in 1775, a quick war against a power that seemed to be redundant, that was certainly what a lot of people signed up for in Boston, then it would have been all over very quickly. But of course, if you were sitting in this, well, not obviously in this building, but on this ground in the winter of 1777, you would have known this was complete absurdity. Because who was here in the winter of 1777? Question time. Anybody, sir? The British. I didn't plant that. I know it's a bright audience, you see. The war was a tough war. You were up against a state which was probably the best system of public finance in the world, running the largest foreign trade in the world, largest navy in the world, a state which had extensive experience of campaigning in North America. After all, they'd conquered New France, aka Canada, between 1758 and 1760, and that was a much harder terrain and environment to deal with than areas like this. It was a state that had had experience in counterinsurgency warfare. They defeated the Jacobite risings. They're to go on to defeat the Irish Rising of 1798, Cornwallis incidentally being in charge then. The government had just won the 1774 general election. It's in control of the legislative process. It goes on to fight another general election in 1780 and wins that as well. And the key British bases in the Western Hemisphere, the naval bases, are at Kingston and English Harbour in Jamaica and Antigua and in Halifax, Nova Scotia. None of those are challenged. So in many senses, this is a really tough war. It's made even tougher because a lot of Americans are loyalists, including many in Philadelphia, of course. A lot of Americans are loyalists. This is a civil war more complex than the Civil War in the 1860s because there were loyalists and patriots more widely distributed across the 13 colonies. And on top of that, most of the Native Americans who chose to get engaged were on the British side. So this is complicated. The first war ends very easily. By the end of March 1776, the Americans have won. There isn't a single British soldier anywhere in the 13 colonies. The British had been unprepared, they have a small army, they don't have conscription. The Americans kick them out. What America hadn't signed up for was the Empire Strikes Back. The arrival in the summer of 1776 of the largest expeditionary force Britain had hitherto sent abroad pops up at on Staten Island. And of course, America has got no navy. I mean, it has individual ships with brave captains and brave crews, and those individual ships are capable of being successful in ship-to-ship engagements. But what it doesn't have is a navy. It doesn't have a squadron-sized navy. So if the British want to, they can send a fleet anywhere they feel like on the eastern seaboard of America, and there's absolutely nothing the Americans can do about it unless they can successfully defeat it once it's landed. That's really serious. Incidentally, same anxiety for the North during the Civil War. Because, of course, the problem about the British thinking of intervening and the French thinking of intervening, the French are egging the British on, is that Britain then has the largest navy in the world and France has the second largest navy in the world. And that's why, incidentally, if you look at American cities of the early and mid-19th century, and you look at their fortifications, you will notice that the fortifications are designed against coastal attack. I take it those of you who've been to San Francisco can see the fort that still survives just underneath the Golden Gate Bridge at the southern side. That fort was put up as soon as the Americans had taken control in the 1840s against the evil Brits if they were to show up. So there is this problem. Now this problem in 1776 means a British expeditionary force landing in New York, landing in Staten Island, then landing in Long Island, defeating Washington at Long Island, then landing in Manhattan, taking Manhattan. Okay, nothing much you can do about that. And in fact, New York remains under British control for the entire remainder of the war. The British, of course, are helped by the fact that the United States is different, clearly, in many different ways to today. But geopolitically, the key element is this. 75% of the population lives within 75 miles of the coast. And everybody that counts lives near the coast. That is where political and economic power, as well as the population, is concentrated. America is not as its modern self-image is. America is not as Jefferson imaged it as being, a sort of country of rural, self-reliant farmers. The America of 1775 is much more like modern Australia. You know, Australian men, a lovely country, Australia, lots going on there. It's very pleasant, has all the advantages of America without drive-by killings and some other factors which we won't talk about. But the thing about Australia, which is funny, is the men all present themselves as sort of people who spend their time wrestling with crocodiles and being he-men. But as you will know, if you've been to Australia, it is a profoundly urban place. Everybody lives in Sydney or Melbourne, Hobart or Brisbane, Adelaide or Perth. The country is largely empty. Exactly the same with America. Everybody that counted lived in cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, Savannah, or nearby. And they were dependent on trade with the outer world. They were very vulnerable to a sea-borne assault in a way even greater than America was vulnerable in the 1860s or indeed in 1940 when Roosevelt got past the Two-Ocean Act because he was worried after the fall of France and the potential of the fall of Britain of German warships showing up off the east coast of America, particularly the Bismarck. Just as a little interlude, one of the most interesting aspects, I went some years ago to a museum, a small museum on the shores of the Chesapeake, and it had out the fire plans for the guns, these enormous railway-borne guns the Americans put in 1940 around the Chesapeake in order to deal with battleships like the Bismarck attacking Norfolk. Really interesting to think about this continual sense of vulnerability to attack from the ocean, which is something that is worth thinking about as a geopolitical constant in American history. Now, it currently focuses, if you were to go and visit Newport, you will find that the naval war planners there are considering what would happen if the Chinese submarines had, intercontinental ballistic missiles and were just sitting in international waters 100 miles off California. Nothing to prevent them, it's not illegal to do so. That itself presents another whole host of issues and problems at the present day. Reversing back to the 18th century. So the British are able to stage a series of amphibious operations. Some work, some don't. The initial attack on Charleston doesn't work. They're not all successful. But between 1776 and 1780, successive expeditions take Philadelphia. They take, and as you know, they came round they sailed round in the end and then landed and beat the Americans at Brandywine and turned up here. They take Newport, Rhode Island. They take Savannah. They take Charleston. The biggest individual American surrender in the war is the fall of Charleston in 1780. Benjamin Lincoln, no relation to the Lincoln here, had been sent down to command the army in the South. The army, very foolishly commanded, gets themselves bottled up in the position. Always a mistake. You should have a small garrison in, and you should keep your army in the field to challenge any besieger. He doesn't matter. The citizenry and the army decide that they will die fighting against the evil Brits, and then the swine start dropping red-hot shot in, and the citizens press Lincoln to surrender next day, and they surrender. What it captures was this vulnerability. Now, it would be a mistake to go on to then say, this would be crude geopolitics. I'm not offering you crude geopolitics, and the FPRI does not offer crude geopolitics. It would be a mistake to go on and say that the independent variable that changes that is France's entry into the war. I mean, I have to tell you, I once gave a lecture in France on, could the British have won the American War of Independence? And a senior Frenchman came up to me afterwards and said, obviously in French, so I'll translate it. He said, this is quite a simple issue. Of course, we won independence for Americans and we gave it to them. That would be a mistake. That is a mistaken view. But certainly, the geopolitics of international conflict complicated that war. So let's start playing through that and thinking about it. The key element for the British in 1775, 1776, 1777, and the first 6 months of 1778 is they were in a really unusual position, which put an enormous burden on their patriot opponents. And that was as simple as this. Britain, which was then a great empire with global commitments, as the United States is today, the great power with global commitments, Britain was at war with simply nobody else at that point. She was in confrontation with simply nobody else at that point. It was the worst conceivable time to rebel against Britain. The worst conceivable time, because that meant that the British could focus their resources, including their ability to raise capital, their ability to hire subsidy troops, up to a maximum of 37, maybe even 39% of the British Army in North America were people that they'd paid to fight there. Well, of course, soldiers always fight for pay, but you understand the point. Non-British people who they'd paid to fight there. And Britain was able to focus. Now that focus changes after 78. That does not mean that the change in that focus causes Britain's defeat, because the British have already failed to defeat the Americans in 75, 76, 77, and the first 6 months of 78. So the Americans have already won the strategic victory of denying their opponents success. So that is the answer to the Frenchmen. Don't be ridiculous. The Americans had already stopped the British because the Americans had, yes, they suffered defeats. They also have victories. Saratoga, very major victory. Germantown, a drawn battle, but the very ability to have a drawn battle, field battle with the British so soon after Brandywine was a very strong message that the British were not in battlefield control. But there was a more significant military political failing that the British were encountering, which was that they could deliver victories if their opponents all chose to stand and fight in a particular place, and if they were successful on that day. But that these did not have the consequences in terms of destroying their opponent's will, ending their resilience, weakening their, as it were, willingness to fight. That element always has to be part of the geopolitical equation. As Alan said, it's what people are thinking in the localities, how they perceive power, how they understand force and the equations between force and obedience. After all, you can kill people. They can decide, okay, we're willing to accept those casualties and we're going on. And one needs to be able to think through the implications for that. The British, in a sense, were stuck. Even if the French had not come into the war, the British were stuck because they had not got the ability to translate battlefield successes into a wider political equation of success in the 13 colonies. Yes, there were loyalists, probably roughly the same number of people as there were patriots. People are uncertain about this. You know, there was nobody took a public opinion poll and said, you know, are you a loyalist, are you a patriot? People are uncertain, and of course loyalists were concentrated in some areas, patriots were concentrated in some areas. Loyalists were particularly concentrated in the south, which is very interesting again if you're looking at the wider geography of political geography of America. Georgia, for example, heavily loyalist state, a lot of North Carolina, heavily loyalist, and so on and so forth. But the significance is that the British hadn't got a way to move past it. And of course, the British are fighting a war, in part to reduce the burden on the imperial treasury of North America. In part, they don't want to fight a war. Britain is very unusual as a power, as America was to be in the 19th century. It is not a power that has conscription. Remember that. One of the significance of the Union League is the Union League starts at a period of time when the North has not yet introduced conscription. And conscription is always an unwilling factor. As you know, the North does not introduce conscription in 61 or 62. No? So in other words, you need volunteers to come forward. You need a public culture of voluntary activity. Britain is exactly the same. I mean, you know, in many senses, they are, you know, what was it, two countries separated, you know, shared language, but, you know, separated values or whatever. The fact is there are similar values. There are similar values. Opposition to a large standing army was always part of the political creed of both states. So the British have a tiny standing army. They don't want long-scale war. They have rulers who don't strut around in uniform. They don't see themselves as a militarized society. And the only branch of the military that really has the affection of the British is which? The Navy. Not the army. The army does not have the affection of the public. The British don't want a long war, but they have got no way out of it by the middle of 78, which is when France comes in. What France and the more global, as it were, role in the latter stage of the war, the second stage of the war, does is not to give liberty to the Americans. The Americans have already got their liberty. After all, if you think about it, if you lived in, shall we say, well, if you lived in Virginia by the late summer of 1775, British authority had collapsed. British authority doesn't come back again. I mean, you know, Cornwallis marches in 81, and there's raiding round the Chesapeake in 80 and 81. But, you know, the Virginian government goes on as a patriot government all the way through, raising taxes, rowing about who's to pay for the war, taking part in all the activities that is part of a democracy. And they've already, Connecticut, for example, is essentially already independent. So the British have essentially already failed in some respects. But what the broader aspect of the war does is, on the narrow part of America, it makes it easier to produce the solution which the Americans want. Because if you think about it, the problem with this war is a simple one by the time of British entry. Nobody has won. So often the case with war. We're used to the idea of World War II, total victory, though it wouldn't have seemed total victory if you were a liberal, for example, living in Eastern Europe and having to put up with the Soviets coming in. But, you know, a notion of total victory over the Germans and the Japanese is what you actually get as your image of World War II, and it's created and conditioned our idea of war. It, in fact, is highly untypical. Most wars do not end with total victory. Most wars end with a compromise of some type or other. Now, initially, it had seemed the case that it was quite clear what compromise would come out of the rising, the violence, the fighting in Massachusetts in 1775. And that's a quite simple one. When does America declare independence? 76. Initially, people don't want independence. What they want is for George III totally to change the way he is governing America. That's why they don't declare independence in 75, even though fighting has started. even though quite large fighting is started. What they think is going to happen is surely this man is going to realise you do not govern us like that. That you have a form of limited government in which we are completely self-governing and we actually determine our rates of taxation, what we spend them on, and pretty well, all sorts of things. Remember, that was not that stupid a view, because the really crucial thing for most of these communities was religion, to a much greater extent than us, and you already have a situation that the established church, the Church of England, does not pertain in the colonies, and the individual colonies are able to form their own religious settlements as they wish and as they feel necessary. So Massachusetts is different to South Carolina, is different to Virginia, and so on, and the King's government's perfectly okay with that. So if they can allow that, why don't they understand what we ought to be having? Well, it doesn't happen. I can explain why if you like, but we don't really have time. It doesn't happen, which means that the Americans are pushed into something they really didn't want. There were always some who wanted independence, but most Americans in 75, when the fighting started, did not want independence. They're pushed into independence, which is a non-compromise, because the British, George III ain't going to concede that. Then they find themselves in a military mess. Military mess, very simply, because quite clearly, for the revolution to work, you've got to kick the British out of North America. How, if you live in the state of New York or the state of New Hampshire, can you put up with the fact that there are going to be big British garrisons in Montreal, in Quebec? So you've got to get them out of Canada. And of course, the Americans try and export their revolution in late 75. It briefly succeeds. The British are kicked out of Montreal. The British garrison has to flee into the citadel at Quebec, and then it goes totally pear-shaped. They fail to storm Quebec. A British relief army arrives. The Americans are beaten and bundled out of Canada. Not a campaign that tends to be written about very much by Americans. It's one of the, it's one of the more interesting, one of the more decisive campaigns of the war, actually, because having kicked the Americans out, the Americans don't come back again. It's one of the more decisive. So what that means to start off with is North America is going to be divided. Where that division occurs is going to be unclear. And remember, the same thing in the South. Do the Americans kick the British out of the colonies? At that stage, there isn't a colony of Florida. It's called East Florida and West Florida. East Florida is Florida minus the Panhandle. West Florida is the Panhandle over to the Mississippi. Do the Americans kick the British out? No. Is there a revolutionary movement down there? No. So quite clearly, there is going to be a division of North America. What is unclear is where that division is going to come and what form it's going to take. For example, will Georgia be part of British North America with Florida? Might even South Carolina, if the British reconquer that, be part of it? What is going to happen? What is going to be the nature of this state? And crucially, after the British amphibious attacks, how the hell are the Americans going to get the British out of New York, out of Charleston, out of Savannah? Let's take 1782. Again, this is a year that doesn't get written about very much in America. In 1782, the Americans have won at Yorktown the previous October. What does George Washington try and do in 1782, anybody? Difficult question. As you may have known, I wrote a book on James Bond, so if you get it wrong, I press a little button here and you get a mild shock, because they're very nice people, the people that run this. They've just, and because of health and safety, and they're all politically correct, it can only be the mildest of shocks. It'll feel as though you're on a heated seat in a car. But be under no illusion, we will know. Sorry, who was going to answer that? But didn't he want to attack New York? He wanted to attack New York. Absolutely. Well done. He wanted to attack New York. Did it succeed? No, it was a total failure. The last campaign of the year was a total failure in the middle colonies. And that was not because Washington was he wasn't a particularly good, he was a good political commander. He was a sort of Eisenhower figure. He wasn't really a brilliant tactician. It's not because of that. It's because it was a jolly difficult task. A really difficult task to try and take New York. So it's going to have to end in a compromise peace of some type, like most wars. What French entry makes decisive is that the compromise peace is going to work for the Americans. Now, you can play that several different ways. If you want to be cynical, and, it's always worth listening to the cynical argument, listening to the less cynical argument, it's always worth thinking of both. If you want to be cynical, think about the fundamental strategic problem facing the British by the end of 1781, the beginning of 82. They've lost at Yorktown. It's clear to them after that they are not going to be getting out of this war on the basis of the Americans returning to their loyalty. You can be as obtuse as you like, and George III actually threatened to abdicate because he didn't want to face that reality. You can be as obtuse as you like, but that's fairly clear. So, okay, that's the situation. What is the strategic problem facing the British, anybody? You're up against who at that point? France, Spain, the Dutch, the Americans. You're also fighting a couple of wars in India against Hyder Ali, of the Sultan of Mysore, and against in southern India and against the Mahrattas in western India, and they're pretty serious wars. Okay, the problem is this. You don't want to move into a peacetime world in which there is this major coalition against you. And this major coalition may press on. The British were anxious about the possibility that this coalition is going to press on and try and either encourage dissidents in other parts of the empire, particularly Ireland, or maybe just try and seize territories itself. The Spaniards, for example, wanted Jamaica and Gibraltar back. The French wanted Canada back. You know, they're worried about this. So for the British, the real strategic challenge is to split that alliance, to destroy it. And this is an aspect at the end of all wars that you need to think about. If you are winning or losing, whichever you are, you want to make sure that your opponent's alliance is destroyed at the end of that war. It's a key element of war closure that's very, very significant. Now, what the British did, actually having lost the war, let's be clear about it, what the British did having lost the war is they won the peace, but they won the peace on terms that worked very well for the Americans, which is actually just as well for world history, but we'll leave that to one side. They won the war on the, because what did they do? They thought, right, we are not going to go for multilateral negotiations. We're going to go for unilateral negotiations. Even if the ones with the Americans are conducted in France, they are going to be separate from the ones we're conducted for the French. We're going to hold our talks separately. So what they do is they work out which of their opponents is likely to rat on the others most. And who is that? The Americans. They realise that the Americans are much more likely to rat on the others than anybody else. They offer the best deal to the Americans. They're clear out of the 13 colonies. They'll give back what you call the Old Northwest, which, you know, there was no American soldier up there. They work this one out, and then the Americans will simply agree, and that's fine. That's what happens. They give good terms to the Americans. Who do they then decide to offer the next best terms to? Anybody? Anybody know who signed second? Yeah, no, it's not Lord North at this stage. It's the French is the second one. So they offer some West Indian islands to the French, and they offer back a slave trading station, but nothing else. The French then sign, and then when the Spaniards say, well, we'll sign, but we do want Gibraltar and Jamaica, the British said, get stuffed. And the French and the Americans are not going to fight to get Jamaica and Gibraltar, so you've lost. So the Spaniards aren't very pleased. They have to make do with East Florida and West Florida, and in that period, they'd captured Pensacola, but in that period there's virtually nobody living in East Florida. I mean, you think about Florida without air conditioning, with mosquitoes and with native Indians all over the place. So they give them what they don't want, which is Florida. And the end of the people that are left to the last are the Dutch, and they get absolutely nothing, you know, because they've been abandoned by everybody else. So that is how you end that war. There is a geopolitical dimension. But of course, taking aside the cynicism, that works in part because of fundamental aspects of the geopolitics of the American Revolution. One of the things that Americans don't tend to comment on is the really interesting dimension, which is a dimension that's remained important to American public culture ever since, and it's as follows. Americans postulate as their founding documents and their doctrine a notion of universal rights. Think about the Declaration of Independence. It is a declaration of universal rights about, in a sense, the right of human beings to, Jefferson's phrases. But the key element is that with exceptions, and we can talk about the exceptions, and they reflect a lot on the geopolitics of the 20th century, but with exceptions, Americans were for a long time very reluctant to export that ideology. Okay? Very reluctant. I mean, you think about American approach to the Latin American wars of independence in the 18-teens, 1820s, for example, or the enormous reluctance of the Americans to get involved for a long time, which when they're much more powerful later in the 19th century, in the two big Cuban risings against Spain. The first one they don't want to get involved in at all. So the Americans offer a set of universal human values, but do not try and export it. This is totally different to the French revolutionaries, let alone the Russian revolutionaries. The French revolutionaries, there is a well, I have to tell you, it's pretty chilling. I mean, you know, this sort of, you know, schoolboy debating society stuff with the guillotine to get rid of your opponents. The debates of the National Assembly go as follows. You know, they set forth universal postulates, the rights of man, you know, universal postulates, attack on feudalism, we're going to get feudalism around the world. Danton asks at one point, does this mean we are going to go to war with China to free the Chinese peasants? And, you know, you can just imagine, you know, crowds of enthusiasts within the chamber shout, yes, we will fight China. Of course, there was no way they could fight China, but that kind of ludicrous assumption that you can readily export the revolution helped to mean that what might or might not have been possible for the French revolutionaries with it to do within their own country, we don't know what that might have been, leads instead rapidly to a revolutionary war with others who, not surprisingly, other countries don't want revolutionary values thrust down their throat. And then what happens is you get the overthrow of the Republic by Napoleon, and it gets replaced by a sort of, you know, souped-up Mussolini, which is what Napoleon is. Now, in other words, the Republic is destroyed because of the geopolitics they construct is one that insists on war. Same thing in a way with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, having lost its original war of expansion, beaten when it invades Poland in 1920, a big attempt on their part, beaten when they try to conquer the Baltic republics, essentially because of foreign intervention. The Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s goes, in effect, having brutalized its internal population, goes onto a war production footing quite rapidly with periodic panics about war with people. There's a 1923 idea of war against Germany and Poland. It's a 1927 war panic, which Stalin uses to discredit his opponents, etc., etc., etc. So in other words, one of the things that cements the authority of the party, and particularly brutal elements within the party, is living in this notion of continuous war. Now, what is different about the United States is, yes, it does engage in continuous war. You ask Native Americans what they would have felt about American power in the 19th century. But the practicality of great power war is that the geopolitical expression of the United States is not one of getting involved in war. The next war they fight after, the next significant war they fight after the War of Independence is against the evil Brits again. They fight a small war against the French, the so-called quasi-war from 1797 to 1800. And those of you who are Pennsylvanians or Philadelphians will know that your predecessors at that period grouped together and did, in effect, what the Union League did. They actually paid for a warship. I hope you know that. There's a long tradition in Philadelphia of people of prominence within the city combining together to actually help the military. But in fact, it was because the French had been attacking American trade, and the American government kept it very low key. They didn't do anything like sending an expedition to try and capture French islands and so on. So the real war that starts is 1812. And of course the Americans blunder into that war because they thought they wouldn't have to do much fighting. In June 1812, America declares war on Britain. Does anybody know what else happens in June 1812? Difficult question. Think what's going on in Europe. What else happens in June? What happens in 1812? What does he do? What does Napoleon do? He invades Russia. Napoleon invades Russia in 1812 with an American diplomat, in fact, American envoy in his train. 600,000 men invade. It's obvious to everybody. Napoleon is going to succeed. He's in charge of an enormous coalition. Prussians and Austrians are on his side. Britain is the only power that is allied with Russia. The British can't do much to help the Russians. The Russians are going to fail. The British will then probably have to give in. I mean, a Canadian historian, Richard Glover, once famously described the Americans in 1812 as like Mussolini in 1940, coming in on the side which they were certain were going to win. You know, obviously they were kicking in the door of a collapsed empire. And well, it goes wrong, unfortunately. Napoleon loses, and as soon as Napoleon loses in the 1812 campaign, then obviously the Americans have lost the War of 1812. They actually get beaten. You know, their expeditions to Canada fail, but it wouldn't have mattered if they'd succeeded. You know, Britain's now on the winning side. The British will come back and thwack them unless they get out of Canada. That was not a major war that the Americans had won. The Americans don't want a major war. America doesn't fight a major war, because the Mexico-American War is not really a major war. They don't fight a major war till the Civil War. And therefore you get the highly unusual feature of American public culture, a very benign feature, a very attractive feature, that America as a society becomes the great power. By the end of the 19th century, it's the greatest manufacturing state in the world, becomes a great or the great power without actually having to militarize its society. It militarizes for the Civil War and then demilitarizes. Most of the Civil War effort from the North is volunteer, etc., etc. You know, Americans by 1865, the Union has the second biggest navy in the world. It then gets rid of it. You know, they're not after colonies in Africa then, like, you know, they take a few islands in the Pacific, relatively small scale stuff for a country of that size. So America actually creates a political mechanism and a public culture that works on being a great economy, a great country, but not an expansionist or fundamental military power. The challenge for the United States in the 20th century, and the challenge today, is America, for its own correct sense of its own interests, and indeed, I have to say, for the interests of many other people in the globe, is expected to be the world's greatest power with military implications and financial implications, which actually spell all sorts of difficulties for inherited practices in public culture and politics. That is a challenge. Most people in the world would be delighted to have your challenge, but it is a challenge, and that is the fundamental geopolitical construction of modern American politics. Thank you. Is that all right? Yeah, of course it is, yeah.
Well, that was a refreshing look at the Revolutionary War, as well as a few other wars in between. We will take questions. Peyton is carrying the microphone. We ask you to speak directly into the microphone.
I have a glass of water, sorry. Oh.
What was the basis for the loyalist sentiment in the Deep South, since Britain was fomenting slave rebellion?
The British in Virginia, the last governor, said that slaves who left their masters, if their masters were patriots, would be given shelter, and indeed they were. But it wasn't actually fomenting a full-scale slave rebellion. In the South, in Georgia and in much of North Carolina, it plays out essentially as a religious struggle. Those people who are Episcopalians tend to be pro-British. Those people who are Congregationalists or Presbyterians tend to be patriots. And if I might just take that a point further, all countries do this, okay? So all countries do this. My country has all sorts of public myths, and we've had plenty of time to build them up. One of the ways in which state building in America was very important, and one of the ways state building, and you know, in a federation, it's very complex how to build up a sense of community. And one of the ways that this was done after 1783 was to provide a set of narratives. And one of the standard narratives is pretty well everybody had been a patriot, and there were only very, very few loyalists. Okay, it's like in France in 1945, everybody was in the resistance, so the same sort of thing. But the other one, which was really important and was linked to this, was to downplay the role of religion in the American War of Independence. Now, clearly, religion itself is not the only factor, but there is a very potent religious element to it, that in a sense, those who see themselves as opponents of George III tend to resent first him as a bad father, and second as somebody who they are convinced is trying to introduce an Anglican hegemony in North America, to impose bishops, rather like actually the Scots rebelled against Charles I. And that element is certainly very important in New England, very important in New England.
Do you think the American Revolution would have occurred differently had the 7 Years' War not occurred?
Again, a very interesting question. So the gentleman's asking whether there would have been a revolution in 1775 if there hadn't been what the Brits call the 7 Years' War, which is 1756 to 63, and the Americans call the French and Indian War. And they usually date as starting in 54, because 54 is when the fighting started, although war isn't declared to 56. The argument goes roughly like this. It's a good question. The argument goes roughly like this. The 7 Years' War is a major struggle, again, fighting all around the world. Spain comes into the war. The British are fighting in the Philippines, in Africa, in India, in home waters, in Germany, in Portugal, in the West Indies, in North America. It is an enormous war. It pushes up the national debt to a level never before experienced. The British always seem to imagine that this was the end of the world. In fact, the national debt goes on rising, and Britain doesn't go off the gold standard until the end of the 1790s. But the point is that after the war, there's retrenchment, and an aspect of retrenchment is an attempt to not just cut costs, but also to raise taxation. Now, part of that taxation is raised in Britain, and indeed there's large-scale riots in the west of England against the cider tax, because they introduced the taxing of cider, which had never hitherto been taxed. And in America, it leads to the Stamp Act crisis, and exactly as you say, starts to lead Americans, most Americans in 1760, 61, 62, 63, had actually been very pro-British. I mean, they put George III on a statue in New York. You know, there are lots of Americans who are only delighted that James Wolfe, dying outside Quebec, had actually freed them from the fear of the French to the north. You know, there is this very potent, a lot of Americans had taken part in the expedition against Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh in 1758. The majority of that force were Americans. So that was, in some respects, an Anglo-American undertaking in North America, the 7 Years' War. But the financial crisis and the way it is played through, mishandled in Britain, misrepresented in America, both kind, I think one can say both, okay, means that it becomes a political crisis which ultimately was unnecessary. Ultimately, the practicality is that America would have become independent anyway. Whether it needed a war to do it is another question entirely. On anything? I'm quite happy to answer. Yes, sir.
What were the controlling variables that motivated the French to enter the war, and how much influence did the American diplomats who were entreating them have on them?
That's, again, an excellent question. First of all, the American diplomat in question, of course, is most prominently a Philadelphia figure, Benjamin Franklin. There were other American diplomats, but he was the key one and the most able. There is a lot of debate about what the French were doing. You can look in what is known as the Archives étrangères. There is the papers of the ministers, and you can look at that, and of course you've got the age-old problem, do people write down what their actual motive is? So all I can tell you is what they write down. And it was a more particular problem because in 1778, France had a choice. Not a choice between do we fight the Brits or do we not? That was one choice, but a much more profound choice. War broke out in Europe in 1778. War between Austria and Prussia. France was Austria's ally. So there were some French ministers who said, stuff this on the other side, we have to fight the Prussians. They'd after all fought the Prussians in the last war as allies of the Austrians in the 7 Years' War. France had fought then. So this was, as it were, a second war. We should, much as we'd like the British to be weaker, we should be dealing with the Prussians. Then on top of that, there's an element of complication further. The French foreign minister, and one of the more influential ministers, was a man called Vergennes. There are two biographies of Vergennes. He's somebody that's attracted a lot of attention. The main one is by an American called Orville T. Murphy, now alas dead, and another American, Jonathan Dull, wrote a diplomatic history of the American War of Independence in which he focused on Vergennes. He's a Vergennes specialist. His main book was on Vergennes and the French Navy. Their argument, now this may be, because the documents are quite elliptical, this may be far-fetched, but their argument goes as follows. Vergennes had had his formative years as the French ambassador in Constantinople. He was an Easterner, he was an Eastern specialist. France had traditionally had a barrier de l'Est, allies with Sweden, Poland and Turkey, all of which had been traumatized, beaten up, lost territories to Russia over the previous 70 years, in fact over the previous 80 years. The argument they make is as follows, and there are one or two documents of Vergennes that I've read which are suggestive, that what Vergennes wanted was a European coalition to drive out and away the Russians. That he saw the principal obstacle of this being that the British weren't willing to play ball. In 1772, in 1773, the French had tried to persuade the British to join with them against the Russians in the Baltic. So according to that argument, what they actually wanted to do was to bop the British on the nose, persuade the British that they really ought to, as it were, fall into French priorities, but ally with the British, not destroy the British Empire, but get the British to ally with the French against the Russians. Now, that's an example of geopolitics, which the interesting thing from an American perspective is this. What it reminds you of is the extent to which we are, all of us, even a great power like America, involved in more complex diplomacy. Think, for example, on 1866, 1867. What is the greatest challenge facing America in international terms in 1866, 67? Does anybody know? It's a difficult question. If you don't know, don't worry. No, the greatest challenge is this. There is a large army to the south of America in Mexico, which is a French army, which has put in the brother of the Austrian emperor, Maximilian, and Napoleon III is hostile, put it mildly. And the Americans are much more sympathetic to the Mexican liberals. Now, the Americans start saber-rattling, they move troops to the Rio Grande, they provide arms for the liberals, but fundamentally the Americans don't want a war, and they can't have a war because they've just demobilized their army, you know? And anyway, the French are pretty good, you know? So they don't want a war. What happens? When does the French-American War of the 1860s occur? Well, it doesn't occur. Why doesn't it occur? It doesn't occur because in 1866, the Prussians absolutely thrashed the Austrians. Napoleon III, worried about the situation in Europe, worried about German unification around Prussia, pulls his troops out of Mexico. He leaves Maximilian there, who refuses to withdraw, and Maximilian tries to go on fighting and gets killed, obviously. But the French have pulled out the troops, and that means that the Americans, as it were, the solution they want is going to occur. But it's not because of, as it were, something specific to North America. Now, you could write a narrative about that in which it's all to do with the liberals keeping going, and that is a factor, but the real factor is the French just pull their troops out.
Thank you. I think you'll agree that the range of data over which Jeremy has command is truly breathtaking. So we thank you, Professor Jeremy Black. We thank the Union League and Ed Trzanski for hosting us. And we thank all of you for joining us. I hope to see you again.
Well.